What if grief is a friend that we must meet and embrace before new life comes? So the story of Lazarus, when he dies and Jesus shows up days late, there is something here that I noticed that I'd never seen before that opened up my eyes to both the necessity of grief and the heart of Jesus. I'm going to start off with saying something pretty bold. The majority of people, unless they have taken their heart to love, to God, the majority of people are walking around with unresolved pain and grief. And that unresolved pain and grief leads to patterns and cycles of destructive behavior, either attitudes like anger. Anger is a protective emotion of pain, or cycles and patterns of destructive behavior, addictions, sexual deviance, broken relationships, workaholism, alcoholism, all of that. Because the human heart was made to actually be held in love instead of doing this life on our own and figuring it out on our own. And without an outlet for the pain and the grief, without us opening up our heart, then that pain and grief doesn't have anywhere to go. Grief is extremely uncomfortable because it requires us to face painful emotions. But when we face it and we release it, then it's like we can breathe easier. And I want to note something. Grief is not just when someone dies. To grieve is over any loss. Mary approaches Jesus and falls at his feet. This is the same Mary that spent all of her life savings and poured out on Jesus's feet the expensive perfume. This is the same Mary. So in this scene, she falls at Jesus's feet crying and says, "My Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died." And what do we see next? Jesus weeps. Now, this is the same Jesus who knew all along that he was about to bring Lazarus back from the dead. If that was you and I, we would not want to see someone else in pain. We would quickly be like, whoa. I'm about to raise him from the dead. You do not need to go through this sorrow. You do not need to go through this grief. Everything's okay. I am here to bring him back from the dead. But Jesus does not do that. We read that Jesus wept. Jesus did not bypass grief to get to the resurrection. Love allowed both. And what I saw this morning is Jesus actually had to enter into the grief so that new life would follow. Consider this. Jesus became man for us to see the heart of the Father in the flesh, who God really is. And the way that we see him live his life gives us insight into doing life with God. What if grief is a friend that we must meet and embrace before new life comes? And the reason why I'm concluding that is Jesus did not bypass the grief. He did not stop them from grieving their loss. Jesus gave the opportunity for them to grieve what their experience had cost them. They had seen their brother deathly ill, then that led to death. Then they had to prepare his body for burial. They had to wrap his dead body in the cloths, in the clothing. They had to bury him in the tomb, and then they had to seal the tomb. That is tremendous loss. And Jesus does not bypass their story. In fact, the way that I read it this morning, grief was necessary before resurrection. Jesus met Mary in her grief. He accompanied her. Isaiah 53:3 says that the Messiah would be a man full of sorrows and grief. I've thought about that scripture because why would he have to be a man that experienced much sorrow and grief? Because the brokenness of humanity is full of sorrow and grief. And that is why Jesus says a seed must be buried before it comes to life. So this language of grief being our friend is all throughout Jesus's ministry. And then he demonstrates it firsthand to Mary and Martha. He essentially says, I'm going to accompany you in your grief because this stage is necessary before you see new life. And how does that apply to you and I? We have got to embrace grief before we see new life. And until you deal with your unresolved grief and pain, you are trapped in a cycle and you are not living new life. And that cycle of unresolved pain and grief leads to destructive behaviors. It leads to the anger, the unresolved anger that won't let go. It leads to broken relationships because your heart is made and designed and created to be full of love. And pain and loss and grief is something that holds you back from living. So the next thing we see Jesus do is he asks a question. Where have you laid him? There is a pattern that I'm starting to see about the heart of Jesus. He always asks people questions, not because he doesn't know the answer. He knew where they laid him, but because a question is actually an invitation to relational communication. When Jesus asked them, where have you laid them? He's essentially saying, show me where your grief is. Take me to the place that hurts. You see, redemption never eliminates the reality of loss. And that's why this morning when I read that story, how many times have I read that story? When I saw the heart of Jesus embracing grief just like you would a friend. And he didn't stop their pain. He didn't bypass grief to get to resurrection. That's when I saw that grief, facing your pain, facing your grief, is part of the process that leads to resurrection life. And Jesus, the man who was well acquainted with grief and sorrow, accompanies you in the process of grief. He does not deny the experience of loss just because he knew everything would be okay. And he doesn't draw attention to himself. He doesn't say, I am the hero. I'm here to save the day. Your brother will rise again. He gently tells that to Martha, and that invites a theological conversation. But with Mary, he exhibits embracing grief like a friend would. He sits down with grief and he weeps with her. My friend, you might be listening to this and you have been carrying unresolved pain and grief in your life. And there's behaviors, there's patterns, there's attitudes of your heart that you don't like about yourself. You are stuck in a cycle of destructive patterns and you can't figure out why. I encourage you to take your heart to the Lord, to allow him to ask you, where have you laid your pain? Because you are not going to that tomb alone. Jesus, perfect love, is accompanying you. And before you can get to a life of resurrection, a life of freedom, a life full of life again, grief has to be embraced. He wants to embrace your story within the story. Take me to the place that hurts. I love the beautiful heart of Jesus. He was and is our hero. But instead of drawing attention to himself, instead of living out of ego, He always offers his heart, and he's offering his heart to you today. Death interrupted Lazarus' story, and so do unfinished stories. You might have an unfinished story in your life where there was a sudden loss. You lost something that never really had a chance to live. Jesus wants to meet you there because grief honors love. Grief honors your experience. And the life that Jesus wants to bring after you show him where this pain is buried does not erase the experience of loss, but grief, like a safe companion, leads you to the place of resurrecting life. But how many of us run for years from facing and sitting with grief when it is actually the relationship, the moment with grief that will bring you life again. And just like Lazarus' story, your story is not over. That was not your final chapter. Jesus is here to bring life to you again. Show him where your grief is laid.